All right. All right, I think we're ready. Sorry, I'm running a little bit late this morning. Um, let's have a quick word of prayer and then we'll get started. Our Holy Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your word, and we thank you for our opportunity to come together and study it and encourage each other and apply these things to our lives. We might be good stewards of your grace. Help us to glorify you. Help us to, I pray that our study and our worship and our prayers would be acceptable to you, that you would be glorified. We pray this in your son's name. Amen. All right. We are in, I'm going to finish up real quickly in Matthew 13. Apparently, I've already done something funny, so I don't know what that is. But I'm going to spend this is going to be like about 2 minutes and then we'll move on. But I didn't want to just completely gloss over this last parable without at least talking about it. In Matthew's account, there we go. All right. Matthew's been working through these parables of the kingdom, and he's been talking to his disciples primarily about how that's going to be and what the kingdom growth is going to look like and what for them to expect. And at the very end of that, he asked them a question in verse 51. He asked them, "Have you understood all these things?" And if you're, we've been in Matthew 13 for a little bit, but if you think about when he asked this question, where this idea of understanding in this passage, you remember where Jesus has talked about this idea of understanding already? How's he applied understanding? Who's understood, who's not understood? Yeah, yeah. Mhm. Well, if you go back, uh, in the parable of the sower, it was a really important point, right? When he says, "When anyone hears the word of the kingdom," in verse 19, and does not understand it, there this idea that one of the keys to this kingdom and the growth of the kingdom is going to be understanding the message. I mean, that seems like a very obvious thing for us. But the idea that if you don't understand these concepts and if you don't grasp these things, it's not going to matter. You can't follow Christ without having an understanding of what Christ wants and what he is trying to teach us. There's no such thing as a disciple who doesn't understand the Bible, which is why we study, why we work on this. If we don't understand, then we're not going to be of much use. And I think that's why at the end of all of this, and he's they've come to him with these questions. Explain to us this parable. What does this mean? And he's gone back and Mark even tells us, how do you not understand this? How are you going to understand the parables if you don't understand this one? And so he goes through and explains that to them. And at the end, having done all that and given them this full picture, he asked them this question: Have you understood? And they said to him, Yes. He said, Therefore, every scribe who has been trained from the kingdom for the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old. And real quickly, I always feel like this probably deserves more time than I'm going to give it today, because it's one of those parables that we talked about how some parables are incredibly simple because Jesus tells us exactly what everything means. And some of them are a little bit trickier because he just makes a statement and we're left to figure out, well, what's he talking about here? And the idea, the image that he's using here in verse 51, this idea of someone who's been trained for the kingdom of heaven, like being a master of a house who brings out of the treasure what is new and what is old. The word there for treasure is the word for storehouse. In other words, this is where he keeps all the stuff that he needs to use. And so the idea is, if you're good at what you do, if you understand, if you're a good master of the house, you're going to be able to use whatever's in that storehouse. And sometimes the old is going to be appropriate. Sometimes the tools that you used all your life are going to be the things that you want to use. And sometimes you're going to need something different. Yeah, you're going to need the new drill with the new application and the things, because something came up that you got to deal with, and the old tool isn't going to cover it properly. And so I got to go get this new thing. So I had to be willing not only to cling to the things that matter and important that are old, but I also had to be willing to use new tools when they're appropriate. Yeah. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And you know, when you talk about the scribes that wrote down the law, and he essentially calls them a scribe. You know, anybody that says, "Well, we don't really care about law anymore. We don't care about commandments. It's all about relationships. It's all about love." You know, Jesus says you as disciples, you as apostles are going to be like scribes. In other words, your focus is going to be understanding, interpreting, and passing on the law. That's really what a scribe did. Some translations will use lawyer for scribe. That's kind of the idea. Someone who is versed in the law and the teaching of it and the transmitting of it. And he says that's going to be your job. And of course, that's exactly what he's been saying in Matthew 13, right? You're going to be going and sowing the seed in the kingdom, and you're going to be trying to bring people in, and your job is going to be to preach the word faithfully as God has delivered it to you and understanding it properly. And you can't do that unless you're able to not only look at the law as the scribes and the Pharisees did and say, this is what the value of the law is, and this is what God is trying to show me about who he wants me to be and how he wants me to live, but you're also going to have to see how that fits in with what Jesus is now teaching. And understanding that when my understanding of the old things comes into conflict of what Jesus is telling me, it's going to be time for me to put that away and move on to something else. I mean, the scribes and the Pharisees and a lot of the Jews, frankly, were struggling with this idea that they had it in their mind that the law was pointing them towards a physical earthly kingdom that was going to be run kind of like a physical earthly kingdom would be run. It's going to have, you know, we're going to have a military, we're going to have a kingdom, we're going to have a literal king, we're going to have riches and wealth and power and all these other things, and we're going to be in have worldly prominence. And Jesus says that's a concept that you're going to need to put away because it's not appropriate. It's very much like what we talked about with the wine and the wineskin. You know, there's certain concepts that are from the Old Testament that are very much going to be in line with what Jesus is going to be teaching now. But there's some things that you have brought out of that that are not going to be appropriate anymore, or are going to be misapplied when we look at it in terms of a spiritual kingdom. And so Jesus' point is when you understand that, then you're going to be able to go back to the law. You're going to go to the prophets. You're going to go to the Psalms. You're going to go to all aspects of the law. And then you're also going to be going to the Gospels, the parables. And you're going to be able to properly show all of it in a way that glorifies God and gives the truth of the gospel. And that's really the point he's trying to make. And that's what we see. You know, we read the apostles going out in the book of Acts, when we read Paul and Peter and John and James writing their epistles, that we see them as being good stewards of that household, bringing out things. You know, how many times do each of those men quote the law? You know, for people saying that we're not under the law, they sure quote it a lot. You know, ironically, Paul, when he talks about we're not under the law anymore, probably spends more time quoting the law than anything else because that's the value of it. And understanding that in Christ is what makes somebody a good steward. So anyway, that's all I'll say. Does anybody have anything else they wanted to add on that, or any comments before we move on? All right. Well, let's go then to Matthew 18, and we're going to talk about some parables having to do with compassion. And this is one of those. I wanted to look at the context of this chapter because I think it helps. There's really only one parable. Well, there's two parables, but one that we're really going to talk about today, and that's the parable of the unforgiving servant in verse 21. But there's a whole context to this that I think is useful in looking at this parable and seeing what Jesus is trying to say, and really understanding everything in this passage, because there are some things in chapter 18 that can be easily misinterpreted or misunderstood when we take them out of the context they're intended. If you look how this whole thing starts, it says that, you know, Jesus just, I think we see a new section here. Jesus just had this conversation with Peter about the temple tax, and they've dealt with that issue in chapter 17. And so now in chapter 18, he says, at that time, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And calling to him a child, he put him in the midst of them and said, "Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a millstone fastened around his neck and be drowned in the depths of the sea." Woe to the world for temptations to sin, for it's necessary that temptations come, but woe to the one by whom the temptation comes. If your hand or your foot cause you to sin, cut it off, throw it away. And I'll stop there. He goes on and talks about this idea, the importance of making sure that if there's something keeping you from the kingdom of heaven, you need to get rid of it. This is the most important thing. In the context of it, he's talking about this idea of this little child. He tells him in verse 3, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So, someone who is humble, I think we all understand what that means. But then notice what he says in verse 5, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, but whoever causes one of these little ones who believes in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck. So you've got someone who is presented as a little child, who is humble, who is innocent, who is, yeah, is someone who's put themselves essentially at your mercy. If I make myself as a little child, I'm submitting myself in a lot of ways. What am I going to do with that? Now, not only am I supposed to make myself that person, but from the apostles' standpoint, you're going to be surrounded by people who are going to be submitting to you in the authority that you have been given. So how are you going to deal with that? How careful are you going to be with that person? And he makes the point: if anyone causes this little one to stumble, this is going to be a horrible thing for them. And I want you to keep that in the back of your mind as we keep working through this, because I think that idea of causing somebody to stumble is carried through this entire chapter. And it helps us to understand what the point he's going to make. He goes right after this into the parable of the lost sheep, and we've already talked about that. It's a slightly different context in this passage than what we've been talking about. He talks about the one who has wandered off, and your job is going to be to go and get that person, get that soul, because as he says in verse 14, it is not the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. The one who is humble, the one who is innocent, the one who may have been caused to stumble. The reality is that people stumble, people fall. This is not something the world likes to. This is not a great verse for a Calvinist, because the idea here is pretty clearly that this is someone who has come to God and humbled himself, but something along the way has hindered his progress, whether it's you, whether it's the world, whatever it might be, and he has now drifted away. And your concern for him is going to be one of the key points of that relationship and your job as an apostle, because it would be very easy to say, well, you know what, wandered off, didn't need him anyway, addition by subtraction. That he was just weak. The reason he's gone is because he's weak, and we can't have that. That's just going to be a drain on the church. Can you imagine the attitude that might come up? Maybe we've thought about that. Maybe we felt that way about somebody at some point. And, mhm, yeah, yeah. Just it's just they're going to leave. Go ahead and let them leave. It's nothing we can do about it. He says you need to have a care for that person, because to a great extent, how you respond to this person is going to have an impact not only on his soul but on yours as well. And that's the context, by the way, in verse 15, where he talks about this idea of reconciling with your brother. And I always feel like this is a really important passage from 15 to 20 to keep in the context of what we're talking about. When we go to verse 15 through 20, what are we typically talking about? Why do we go to this passage? What's the question we were asking? Yeah. Yeah, this is the whole idea. We go to this when we want to say, look, I've got an issue. We've got a brother who's in sin. We need to deal with it. And so this is the scriptural pattern. I need to go by myself and talk to him. I need to take 2 or 3 witnesses. If that doesn't work, I take him before the church. If that doesn't work, we disfellowship him. He becomes as a sinner and a tax collector to us. And that's the process. But what's the point of all this? Why is Jesus describing this process? What's the end goal of all this? Yeah, yeah. You're trying to bring him back. This is not about here's how you get rid of the dead weight. Here's how you get rid of the person that's not doing what he's supposed to do. This is the idea of how do you try to bring that person back? Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, you're going to put forth the effort, and this is how it's going to go. And there's two things that come out of that. First of all, is as he says that your goal, as he says in verse verse 15, if he listens to you, you gained your brother. That's the goal of this. But he also makes a point here that there's only so far that you can go, right? Because there's a limitation on that. What's the limitation in this passage? Yeah, yeah, yeah. What if the sheep doesn't want to come back? There's it's not like this is where the parable or the analogy breaks down because if it's a sheep, I can just grab him by the neck and just carry him back to the flock. I can't do that with a person. He has to come back willingly. And the idea is that there's going to be a time where you got to say, you know, we have to move on. And the point that I think that Jesus is making here is that you don't decide when that point happens. God decides. And this is how that's going to take place. I don't get to at some point say, look, we can go through all the steps we want, but we all know how it's going to end. And therefore, let's just cut to the chase and just cut it off right now. That's not what Jesus says to do. He says, you do what I have called you to do. And it's at that point, you have done your job and you will be, and it's kind of like what he tells to Ezekiel. If you go, if I call you to go warn the house of Israel and you go do it and they don't listen, that's fine, but you've done your job. But if you don't go do what I've told you to do and they don't listen, then they're going to be lost, but you're going to be accountable for that. And that's kind of the idea. If we look at this passage and kind of shortchange it and try to skip all the way to the end because we just don't want to go through the work, let's go back to the idea of causing somebody to stumble. What happens if my shortcut is one of the reasons why this person won't come back to the Lord? And I'm liable to that. So Jesus says, this is how you can make sure to do what you need to do to be absolved of any responsibility in this weaker one stumbling. Does that make sense? Any comments? Go ahead. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things where, Jesus says in verse 17, if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. And now what he doesn't mean is treat them like the Pharisees treat the sinners and the tax collectors, which is treat them with, shun them, reject them, turn them. How did Jesus treat the sinners and the tax collectors? Yeah, he called them to, he called them to come back. And that's the point Jesus is saying. It's never about cutting somebody off, but it is about saying we can't have the relationship that we had before. Larry, go ahead. Hmm. 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 Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. 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 Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, yeah, that's right. Now, I will say this because we can go the other extreme on this, and I go back to what Paul says in Romans 5 when he talks about the idea of you're not to keep company with them, no, not even to eat with them. He makes the point. I'm not saying that we can't associate with anybody that's an adulterer or whatever. Then you would have to come out of the world. There's a distinction there that he's saying you're not going to treat this brother the same way that you would treat someone who's just out in the world doing this, which seems like a double standard, but it's not because the situations are different. Your action towards this brother who has been caught in adultery are going to be different than the actions of this person over here who was never a member here to begin with, who's a non-believer that's in an adulterous relationship. Now, they're both sinning and they both need to repent, but he says this person specifically, you're not even to eat with this person. Now, to your point, I think we've taken that and applied that to the idea of shunning. The idea that, well, if I can't eat with them, I can't talk with them, I can't associate. Like you said, I'll just walk the other way. And that's not what his point is. When Paul talks about not eating with somebody, the whole concept of eating with somebody was an implied fellowship. I don't sit down and eat with somebody who I'm not in good relationship with or good standing with or that I don't know. There's a I've had people go so far as to say, well, if I'm going to a wedding and I know a that's been withdrawn from that wedding and he sits down at the far end of the table there, I can't sit on that table again. I can't because we'd be eating in the same space. That's not the point that he's talking about. It's the idea of the fellowship. It's the idea of a relationship. I just can't go for a brother that I would normally go, hey, let's go to Whataburger and grab a burger and talk or whatever. I can't do that with somebody who has been withdrawn from because I can't have that kind of a casual relationship. But you know what I can do? I say, look, I would really like to talk to you about this situation. You want to meet somewhere and we can talk. That's not a fellowship situation. That's me trying to come to terms with you and trying to bring you back. Now, we got to be careful even then that the appearance is not that, well, this guy's withdrawn and Paul's sitting down and hanging out with him just like normal. We can't do that. But there's a balance, and I don't know if I'm saying a lot of this to say I'm not sure I know what exactly the line is on that. But it's something that we've got to bear in our mind and understand in that relationship. Go ahead. Well, we'll find out. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, there's a problem. There's a distinction between somebody who is weak and somebody who's in rebellion. To your point, and like if you've got somebody, I could see an example personally where fellowship might be withdrawn for lack of attendance, but not universally. For example, let's say you've got a member who said, "Look, I just don't want to come anymore. I don't like it there. I don't get along with the people. I just." I just don't. I'm just not down that path anymore. I just don't think I need to be a part of this group. That's very different than from your point, somebody who's just weak and struggling with their faith. And like, yeah, I know. I'll be there, and they don't make it, and they're struggling with that. We're disfellowship people because they're weak. Well, I know you're right. Yeah, I mean, we shouldn't. I, yes. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. 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 It can very well be. And by the way, let's go back to verse 15 where it said what it says. If your brother sins against you, to your point, it's not if my brother disagrees with me. If my brother has a different interpretation of this passage than I do, you're absolutely right. We get caught up a lot of times in being the police of how everything is going to be interpreted. And I've heard people really make this argument. They will say, well, First Corinthians says we all need to agree and be of the same mind. So if you and I can't agree on this passage, then at some point we're just going to have to go our separate ways. And that's not what Jesus is talking about here. I think that's a good point. Go ahead, Larry.
And there's other places where Jesus, like in chapter 7 or chapter 11 or chapter 14,
Mm-hmm.
where he goes and sits down and eats with Pharisees.
Mm-hmm.
They're not fellowship with God.
Yeah.
And then one of them, Judas Iscariot. Now,
Mm-hmm.
Jesus, sit down. He made him at one of the
Yeah.
12.
Yeah.
Expressly said, it's not one of you, devil. Why did he do that?
Yeah.
And he betrayed him not. He sat down and ate, no, ate, he was a hot.
Yeah.
And so there's this, treat him not as an enemy, but admonish him as a brother.
Yeah.
Thessalonians 3:15.
Yeah.
This attitude that we're supposed to have towards someone who maybe we know they're not walking right with God, but
Mm-hmm.
when you see Jesus interacting with them, how are we supposed to be? He's our example pattern for how we're
Mm-hmm.
supposed to treat people like that.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that's why I think keeping this context in mind is so important when you look at passages like this, because is it a command? Yes. Is a set of instructions? Yes. But there's also a point to all of it, and we can be very much in danger, as you said, Linda, about of missing the whole point of this. And it's not about pulling everybody into line behind me. It's about restoring someone who's wandered away from the fold, and trying to bring them back in a way that's best suited to that. Yeah, exactly. And if that's not our goal, then we've completely missed the whole thing. And as your point is, a lot of times it's not about getting that guy to heaven. It's about getting him in line with me, because he's offended me in some way. And that's we could go into all kinds of detail on that, but it's great points.
Or seem to be so eager
Mhm.
to do this. Once it is done, majority of them,
Yeah, yeah, and
because he's embarrassed,
mhm,
and they're going to come out.
yeah,
And I have, who's going to say it, I have a major role
mhm,
with people using this for an insignificant
yeah,
thing. That is for something like adultery and
mhm,
families, not for somebody who got a job because they had to pay some bills and didn't come to church to
yeah,
serve.
yeah,
That is wrong.
yeah, yeah, and it goes back, and I'm probably getting ahead of myself a little bit, but that's fine. When Paul talks in Romans 5, he talks about putting the brother away. In Romans 6, he talks about taking each other to court. And you remember what he said there? Well, it seems kind of contradictory to what he said in Romans 5, but it's kind of in line with what you just said. Like, this person has wronged you. He's taking you to court, and he shouldn't be doing that. Well, what's the answer to that? Well, we should withdraw from him. No, what does he say? Well, just take the wrong. Just just well, but he says in Romans 6, what does he say? Look, if he's that determined to get something out of you, just give it to him. Just take the wrong. Why is it worth splitting the church over something, to your point, that's that's just about me? It shifts the emphasis. It's not about getting what I want or justifying myself or validating my rights. And maybe that's the distinction that we make when we talk about disfellowship, withdrawing from something. We're talking about a sin against God. We're talking about something that has separated himself, that is an act of rebellion against God. It's not talking about you doing something where I want to get my rights back and I want to defend myself. If that's all it is, if I can end this whole thing by saying, you know what, just take it and we're done, and we can just move on. And I think that's the attitude that we need to have. Go ahead.
Well, I'm sorry, but I'm doing this.
I believe. Sure.
I think anybody that has, and I'm just again,
Mhm.
have gone into a church, these fellowships, simply for the way they attended, or and that was all it was. I'm sorry. There's no thing. I'm sorry. Please forgive me of my sins. He's okay. I think they go to hell if they don't come up and ask forgiveness person that they have done this to. Because that's the only way you're going to get this back that you have
Yeah.
done that to.
Well, and like I say, I don't disagree with that. Go ahead, Larry, and we need to move on.
Since I'm forward in front of a congregation and say, well, I say, God, go to that person. It's like you sin against them and I go to that person and make it right. And if you sin against them in that way, it's like, no, that's
Uh,
you have to go to that person and at least try to reconcile the thing that you did,
yeah,
if they're not attending that's yeah, that's
again, I'll t-
It is done in front of the church as well as to that person. Because you embarrass that person to church.
yeah. No, yeah, it needs to be whatever level of communication is appropriate. I'm going to make this. Let's tell this story, but and I'm not contradicting what you're saying. It may sound like I am for a second, but bear with me. Um, when we were in Alabama, you know the story. There was a lady who was very, very vocal when she was in attendance. She wasn't in attendance very often. Yeah, no, you're here. You're here. And she talked a whole lot more than you do, trust me. But it was very, yeah, it bordered on contentious sometimes. But she would not come often, sometimes for legitimate reasons, sometimes maybe not. And she, at one point, I know, that's why I'm not using names. She came for it. She said, you know what, I need to do better. And she came forward at another congregation, not not in front of the group where she was a member. Yeah, well, yeah, I'm not sure that's really helpful. To your point, it needs to be if you're going to make something right, you got to do it where the other people are there. And so that's the only way that works because it's about restoring a relationship. To your point, that's not going to work if you know, I'm going to repent. I didn't have to tell him that I repented. No, you got to make that right, make that pop. So so with that in mind, he makes this argument, and then he says, um, and I'll make an observation on this, and then we'll shut it down, and we'll come back and bring this into the parable next week, Lord willing. But he says, truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again, I say to you, if two of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For wherever two or three are gathered in my name, there am I among them. Now, I've been meaning to do a lesson on this for a long time. I'm sure that I will at some point before too long, but I'll just give you an executive summary of this. We go to this passage and make the argument that as long as we've got two or three Christians together in one room, God is in our midst. That's an assembly, and we can worship. And we make all kinds of applications about that. That's not what he's talking about. And I hope if we read this in this context, it should start to become pretty clear what's going on here. Jesus has made the point to them: you are responsible for this young one, this weak one, and if he stumbles, it's on you, especially if you contributed to it. So now I've just told you that you're going to go to that person and you're going to talk to them. And if they don't agree, you're going to end up cutting them off. It's exactly what you said, Linda. Once you do that, that's a tough way to get back from there. Now, it's not to say you can't, but that's a big step to make. And if I'm the apostles, I'm like, I don't know if I want that responsibility. I don't know that I can ever go that far. And I've known a lot of brethren that will say that. Look, we just man, if we go this step, I get that he's in sin, but if we do this, I don't know that he'll ever come back. But what Jesus says is this is the step you have to take in those situations. And then he says, truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound, or really will have been bound on heaven. In other words, you are acting in accordance with God's will. You're not stepping out on your own now. You're doing this by God's authority. And as he says, when two or three of you are gathered together, and by the way, where does he use two or three earlier in this passage? What two or three is he talking about there? Yeah, the two or three witnesses that went to this person and have now gone before the church in the assembly and said, "This is what we have seen." What's he saying? If two or three who have witnessed all this and come to the church and do what I have commanded them to do by my authority, there I am in your midst. In other words, Jesus says, I will support you in this. If you do it the way that I have called you to do it. To your point, not for selfish reasons, not for frivolous reasons, But if it comes to that point, he gives them the reassurance. And this is why reading this in this context, we ought to know, first of all, anytime it says if two of you agree on earth about anything they ask, we automatically ought to know that's clearly not an absolute, right? If two apostles agreed and said, you know what, I think men should have more than one wife. And we agree on that. Therefore, God's going to accept it. That's not what Jesus is saying here. What he's saying is if you come together and do what I have called you to do by my authority, then you will not be held accountable if, for this person's soul. Larry, go ahead, and then we got to stop.
He said about sin. So
Yeah,
this sin is not this isn't done in weakness.
yeah.
This is a sin unto death.
Mm.
And this is something that a sin that with an attitude that you should be evident with everyone involved. Okay, this person isn't just
Yeah.
sinning haphazardly or something that's this is sinning against God with a high hand, sinning against people. It's evident in the attitude that way, right?
It is. And I will say there's another implication about this. Is this isn't somebody who's left the Lord. Now, and I'm not going to go down the road about how we ought to deal with that. That's another question for another day. This is someone who wants to still be in the assembly. I still should be involved in this, and I know that I'm going off and doing these things, and I'm living this life, but it shouldn't matter. You can't just throw me out of the church because I've decided to commit adultery or to do whatever it is that I'm doing, that I'm continuing in sin. This is a situation where the apostles or the brethren are called to stand up and say, you can't be a part of this group anymore if you're going to continue to live in this way. Yeah, 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 yeah. Hmm.
in the church size, in the people size.
Yeah,
It is a big thing. It's not a five-minute church.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and it's not so and so and so and so couldn't get along. By the way, she speaks for all of us so many times in my lesson. I don't understand what he's saying. But yeah, this is something that's, and in fact, ironically, that issue where a squabble between two people ends with somebody getting disfellowshipped ends up doing exactly the same thing that we're trying to avoid, which, to your point, bringing reproach on the church. When we allow sin to go unchecked in our members, it reproaches God and it reproaches the church. And when we divide over things that don't matter and we can't get along with each other and can't resolve our differences, it brings reproach on the church. Yeah, 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 yeah.
I apologize.
Mhm.
Point, just almost being bad.
Well, I mean, it's a whole lot of people have been lost for this. Churches have been split that didn't need to be split because we've misused this passage. So
Here, how many years ago, if they had voted for somebody getting this fellowship, I think they are going straight to hell. I do not think saying it now, I'm sorry, please forgive me for all my sins, is going to do this, because they have caused a soul to be lost.
well, there's going to be an accountability. They can be forgiven, and I'll leave up to God as to whether or not they will be or not. But they've got to. If they don't ask for it, if they don't want it, they're not going to get it. One more thing, and then we got to stop.
I was different.
Yeah.
Someone who pretend and say, well, this person's not right with God, so we're going to mark him.
Mm-hmm.
And then, by the way, I also had to say, man, this you had to wear a suit and tie, for of course, in
Mm-hmm.
uniform. So those attitudes do exist.
Oh yeah.
That doesn't mean that everyone in the church, in that whole congregation has to agree.
No,
So,
no.
you know,
But again, that's a whole other discussion that we'll have. Anyway, thank you for your participation. We'll take a break.